The Duchess of Devonshire was ushered into the hall where I was. She asked the Duc de Gramont, who was also there, to introduce her to me and spoke to me enthusiastically about my mother, whom she would very much have liked to know. A few moments later, the king received me in his study. He rose as I entered, seemed rather embarrassed, asked me to sit down beside him, and said nothing. I, with the self-confidence of a person who cannot forget who she is and what she is entitled to in spite of what anyone may do to make her forget it, opened the conversation and informed him how anxious I was to see him in order to express my thanks. The king at once recovered and was throughout agreeable and even courtly. He had been described to me as a man who was witty but hypocritical. I found him, on the contrary, frank and kindly. He expressed his regret at not having had the privilege of knowing my mother. To this I replied that he owed it to her not to forget her memory, since, beside all the good she had done in France generally, she had frequently done favors for persons belonging to his family. I am aware of that, he replied. At Martinique she was an excellent royalist. Rather an odd remark to make about the wife of Emperor Napoleon. After I had told him how happy I was to live quietly in France and to bring up my children there, he suddenly asked this question. Is it true that one day when Bonaparte was particularly well dressed and asked you what you thought of his uniform, you answered, the sword of the Constable of France would be much more becoming to you? Astonished at this query, I thought it best not to reply. As a matter of fact, I had never made this remark. Formerly, owing to my preference for a quiet, calm life, I had doubtless at some time or other expressed my alarm at a rank which displeased my taste for simplicity, but to admit an impression which people might interpret as a criticism seemed to me to be disloyal toward the empire. I sought some way of not offending an elderly man and answered, many words were attributed to me in the past without people taking the pains to find out whether they were true or not. But one thing is certainly true today, namely, that completely absorbed by the education of my children, the only thing I desire is a retired life. He felt, I fancy, that he had made an unfortunate remark and sought to remedy it by saying a great many agreeable things. He finally rose, I did likewise. He asked permission to embrace me, kissed my hand, and added that he would always be glad to see me, whether in public or private. I answered that I considered myself an old woman who had withdrawn from society. The expression of old woman made him laugh. I added that I had no intention of going out in society anymore, but if he wished it, I should be glad to see him occasionally and formally. During the conversation, he seemed to wish to have me meet other members of his family, but I did not feel that it was obligatory for me to do so. Moreover, everything I had heard about them, their personalities, their past, and their efforts to efface it did not make me at all anxious to see them. I thought that this was one visit that was enough. After my reception by the king, the Duc de Gramont and other members of court circles, some of whom I knew and some of whom were new to me, came up and asked if I had been satisfied with my reception. I replied that I had every reason to be pleased, and they all conducted me back to my carriage. When I returned home, all my friends inquired if I was pleased with my interview and exclaimed, "If the king is kind to you, we shall all rally to him." The king told everyone about our conversation and praised me highly. The friendship of the Emperor of Russia had already made me many enemies. The praises of the king completed the hostility which all the prominent people in society felt toward me. It was said that the Duchesse d'Angoulême herself did not conceal her displeasure. The favorite courtiers even went so far as to tease the king about his liking for me and the means by which I might become free to marry him. At any rate, for several days, I formed the chief topic of conversation at court. Certain remarks were repeated to me. The king had said, "I never met a woman, and I have known a great many who was more distinguished in her bearing, more agreeable in her manners." To this, the Duc de Duras replied, "It is true, sire. She is charming. It is a pity she is so ill-advised by her friends. Her only intimates are young men who criticize your government and are your majesty's personal enemies. Everyone was silent, and the king did not continue the conversation. This was the beginning of that new life which I intended to be so peaceful, and which jealousy, a little social success, many domestic troubles were about to make so stormy. My household consisted only of Madame de Boubers, who had returned to me after the departure of the King of Rome, Mademoiselle Hortense, a young woman I had educated at Écouen, and Mademoiselle Cochelet, my former reader. A curious chain of circumstances had caused the latter to become the intermediary between our household and the Emperor of Russia. She wrote him and received very cordial replies. That was enough to make people think she was an important character in European diplomatic circles, and there was gossip about her and her imaginary intrigues. I had also kept with me as gentlemen-in-waiting Monsieur de Marmont and Monsieur de Vaux, and Abbé Bertrand for my children. I still lived at Saint-Leu. The village priest, a kindly soul who was fond of me, informed me when he came back from a short trip to Paris that already I was being accused of holding secret meetings out there in the country. I could not imagine the basis for such rumors, as I received only a few friends. We spent our days taking walks, drawing, playing, singing, or reading, and those who came to see me immediately adopted our habits. The visitors who had never attempted to sketch before frequently furnished amusement for those who were more advanced in this art, but one and all they were obliged to work, and the drawing room at times looked like a classroom, while its occupants enjoyed the simple gaiety of school children. My husband's letter, replying to the one I had written him suddenly, arrived to disturb these innocent pastimes. He refused to listen to my arguments and threatened that unless my son joined him immediately, he would take legal action. I found myself therefore obliged to leave the country where I had expected to stay all winter and establish myself in Paris in order to secure proper legal advice. I was in despair, the more so as I was utterly ignorant about matters of this sort and did not know whom to ask about them. I was immovable only on one point: the impossibility of letting my son leave me, the wish to keep him with me at any cost. My friends pointed out to me that in my position the scandal of a lawsuit would do me a great deal of harm, for people would exploit the slightest accusation brought against me. Then, too, it was the policy of the government to do everything it could to discredit the name I bore. Even my brother wrote me from Vienna that he and the Emperor of Russia both considered that I ought not to involve myself in such a lawsuit. I understood all their arguments. I even knew beyond a doubt that the government desired to make the case sufficiently sensational to distract the public's attention from the debates in the Chamber of Deputies. But when I weighed all this against the loss of my son and what I feared the departure might mean to him, I considered that by going into court I was making a necessary sacrifice to ensure his happiness. I preferred to risk exposing myself to public censure rather than to lose my child. I was obliged to follow blindly the advice of my lawyers, for I scarcely knew what a lawsuit was. My chief advisor was Monsieur Bonnet, and he chose as advisors Bellart, Laborie, and Delacroix-Franville. I turned over to them all my papers, all my husband's letters to me, his act of abdication, the papers which he and the emperor had given me regarding my children, and which until then had made me their sole guardian. My heart broke every time I saw these strangers rummaging about my domestic secrets and preparing to inform the public about all those matters which my husband and I should have kept to ourselves. I wrote him again saying that in the spring I would bring my children to see him, but asking him to spare them to me for at least this winter. My husband, however, insisted that the case should come up immediately, and his agent, so proud of representing, even in a minor capacity, a king, although one who had been dethroned, did everything he could to embitter matters instead of trying to conciliate them. He would consent to no delay, no mutual agreement of any kind, and declared he was acting in behalf of a father. The sufferings this trial caused me are something unimaginable. The majority of lawyers, when they handle a case, think primarily of themselves. They wish to attract attention, and they do not sufficiently adopt their client's point of view. I had expressly ordered Monsieur Bonnet to refer to my husband only in polite terms, to remember the name I bore and wished to have respected, and especially not to mention at any time the Emperor Napoleon, except in such a matter as I might have used myself. But he paid little attention to what I said. Already he was more busy turning over in his mind some effective phrase, some witty remark, which he could make during the trial, than considering my peculiar situation or studying how he could respect certain proprieties to which I attached importance. Moreover, he seemed more anxious about his own reputation than about mine. The first newspaper article which appeared was intended to hurt my husband. I was extremely sorry, and someone acting at my request undertook to have printed the next day some favorable comments on the person who had been criticized. It was amusing to think that I should be at the same time defending myself against my husband and defending him against others. Other articles appeared that made fun of both of us. In such cases, I was always the more severely treated of the two. I was equally hurt by the accusation made by my husband's lawyer that I had abandoned in his hour of misfortune the man from whose rise in rank I had benefited. Such a remark addressed to me, who had wasted my youth and my strength in trying to satisfy a being whose morbid temperament was dragging me to my grave. My conscience was too much above such accusations to be affected by them. What grieved me was that they should thus be made public. Ah, how well I had chosen my motto. One connu, one troublé. The less known, the less criticized. But the more I appreciated the joys of living a retired life, the more fate seemed to upset my plans by making me the center of an agitated and troubled scene. I was told that it was absolutely necessary for me to make certain advances to the judges, to have someone who was favorable to me call on them afterwards. I could not believe this was true. It seemed that such an action would be unworthy of justice and of my cause. Monsieur Hortense, procureur du roi, the lawyer of the king, who was supposed to sum up the case, called on me one morning in reply to an invitation from one of my friends. What could I tell him about the case? I wished to keep my son. He knew this as well as I did. Consequently, instead of speaking of the subject he related to me, under the most formal promise of secrecy, an extraordinary investigation he had been asked to make a few days before, it seemed that a certain Monsieur de Memoirs, after having stolen all the diamonds belonging to the Queen of Westphalia, had been arrested by request of the Emperor of Russia. The Russian minister had received orders to follow up the matter and to try to find the diamonds. The French government had been obliged to take up the investigation. At the time of his first examination, Memoirs had declared to Monsieur Hortense that during the brief period when the provisional government was in office, the Prince of Benevento, Talleyrand, had sent for him and ordered him to assassinate all the members of Napoleon's family. Monsieur Laborie, he said, had given him further detailed instructions, and he had set out armed with full authority, when a sudden thought caused him to hesitate. He was not sure whether this order included the Empress Marie-Louise and her son, or whether they were to be considered as belonging to the Austrian imperial family. He had feared to make a mistake, and returned to ask Monsieur Laborie. Laborie had replied impatiently, "Oh, those two. Do as you please about them. The great thing is to act quickly." The procureur du roi had sent a report of this examination to the government at once, in spite of the request of the Russian minister not to do so. The affair had been suppressed, and Monsieur de Memoirs placed in prison indefinitely. I promised Monsieur Hortense to not repeat this, and kept my word. Imagine my feelings when I found myself face to face with the man whom one of his brother lawyers had chosen to defend my case, face to face with this same Laborie, who shortly before had given orders for the murder of my entire family. I looked at him fixedly. He inspired me with a pity rather than horror. I felt that in spite of the deceitfulness of his manner, he must be extremely embarrassed when in my presence. What thoughts must have been his when he recalled that horrible plan? This conversation with Monsieur Hortense left me no doubt as to the number of enemies who surrounded me and from whom the quietest, most retired life had not been able to free me. I kept daily discovering new ones. They detested me so much that they could not forgive me for having an assured position, a household, and a few friends. Those who were under obligation to me were the ones who most resented my presence. They could not pardon the fact that they owed me and my family so much. They considered it a crime on my part, and consequently it was easy for them to say, "It is at her house the conspirators meet. The king and his family are insulted there. No one would think of being seen at such a place." If the least sign of unrest appeared in some corner of France, I was at once supposed to be the instigator of it. It was by remarks like this that those who were indebted to me for favors sought to repay their debts, although they might have realized that if plotting were going on, if remarks were being made about the king, my personal position was such a delicate one, and my house was certainly so closely watched, that it was the last spot where any political demonstration was likely to be made. Only on one occasion, when Messieurs de Broglie, de Stepdaughter, de Flahaut, de Ségur, Lavalette, and Pergot all happened to be calling at the same time, a discussion came up as to whether, as an appeal for those national liberties which had been promised but not granted, General Excellence should not be advised to refuse to obey an order from the government which arbitrarily forbade his remaining in Paris. The general at the time was not in active service, and everyone agreed that a protest ought to be made against the order. I rose, telling these gentlemen that as the subject they were discussing was too serious for me, I should leave them to continue it among themselves, and I withdrew to my apartment. The party at once broke up, and from then on no political matters were ever talked of in my presence. When I had come to live in Paris on account of my miserable lawsuit, I had expected to receive only a few intimate friends. All this talk of conspiracies, however, made me decide to hold a reception once a week, to which I would invite some of those English people who in vain had asked to be presented to me. In admitting them to my circle, I hoped they would repeat impartially what they saw going on there, and consequently help make the true facts known, which so many people sought to misinterpret. I was not wrong. A Mr. Bruce, a young Englishman whom I had met several times and who had pleased me with his simplicity and idealism, and his accounts of the journeys he had made in Africa, happened to be at the house of the Duchesse de Mouchy, the hostess, Madame Moreau, and a Lady Hamilton, were expressing their astonishment that the king allowed me to remain in France, and described my receptions as being in reality meetings of conspirators against the government. Mr. Bruce protested violently against such statements. You ladies do not attend these receptions, and I have done so. I declare that it is the only house in Paris where one finds the atmosphere of a true French drawing room, which was so justly famous throughout Europe and which no longer exists in your own country. There, at least, people converse without discussing politics. The topics are literature and the arts, and one never hears scandal about anybody. In this case, injustice had brought me a partisan. I had given Monsieur Bontiaguina, the Russian charge d'affaires, permission to come to the house even when I was at home, only to my intimate friends. I did not fear to have anyone see what went on there. I avoided all arguments about political matters and was delighted to think that they were no longer any concern of mine. Yet at the same time, how could I remain deaf to the complaints of Frenchmen who saw themselves humiliated in their own country while foreigners ruled in their place? All I could do was attempt to calm their anger, but new incidents provoked fresh outbursts. The brother of the famous George Cadoudal had just received a title. Was it possible that the Bourbons so openly admitted that they were the accomplices of an assassin? Madame Moreau was authorized to assume the title of Marechal, and her husband had died fighting against us. I was asked to recommend someone to Monsieur Pogo de Borgo in order to obtain a post, and he then made the following naive remark to me. One cannot count on Monsieur de Blacas for anything. Would you believe it? He promised for a long time a post to a man to whom we certainly owe a favor since he helped us capture Paris, and he has not yet secured it. I could not say a word. I was dumbfounded. I was ashamed at the idea of recommending a man who really deserved something to a person who dared boast to me that he was helping a traitor. Thus, my country had been enslaved. It was foreigners who made her laws. How could one blame those who were unable to forget it had been France, that only yesterday had dictated to the rest of Europe? But I felt we must suppress our irritation. The thought of the hot-headedness of our young Frenchmen alarmed me. Every day they became more incensed, while I, constantly prudent, sought to use this very memory of our former grandeur to bring them back to a more reasonable state of mind. I pointed out to them that our armies had won for the French nation the highest honors that could be attained, and that a period of calm was needed properly to appreciate those honors. It was time they became acquainted with and grew to appreciate the benefits of peace, and I urged them to do so. Thus, by degrees, soothing the indignation the unfortunate political situation provoked, I brought them to discuss subjects less perilous and more enjoyable to all. Always our amusements were the same. Billiards, music, reading aloud occupied our evenings.